He was supposed to be invisible that day, just another tired worker in a red and black uniform. No cameras, no entourage, no one pointing or whispering his name. Just the low hum of fryers, the sizzle of oil, and the sharp smell of salt and grease that clung to his skin like a second shirt. The manager had handed him the headset with a bored shrug, completely unaware of who he really was. "Stay by the counter, watch how they do it, and don't slow the line," she said, already turning away. He nodded, feeling the unfamiliar weight of the plastic band against his hair, listening to the scattered voices on the drive-through channel. Orders blurred together, number 5s, no pickles, extra sauce. He repeated them quietly under his breath, trying to sound like he belonged, like he had done this 1,000 times. In a way, that was the point. He wanted to remember what it felt like to be small in the world again, to disappear into a place where no one expected anything from him except speed and a practiced smile. Beside him at the register stood the young cashier, her name tag slightly crooked, letters worn at the edges. "Maya." She moved fast, fingers flying over the keypad, her voice steady as she greeted customers with the same tired, automatic cheer. But up close, he noticed the details the crowd missed. The faint tremor in her hands when she reached for a cup, the way her eyes flinched at raised voices, the way her shoulders curved inward as if trying to make herself smaller. She had those dark half-moons under her eyes that don't come from one bad night of sleep, but from months of barely holding it together. A man at the counter snapped his fingers at her because his fries were taking too long. "I've been waiting 10 minutes, he said, though the order screen showed 2. "What are you people even doing back there?" She swallowed, apologized, and offered a free sauce as if that tiny gesture could soothe the sting of being spoken to like she was less than a person. He watched the way her jaw tightened, the way she forced her mouth into a polite curve, the way her eyes flicked once toward the exit, like someone imagining an escape they knew they couldn't take. On his break, he sat alone at a corner table, sipping a paper cup of flat soda, listening to the scattered conversations around him. A kid complaining about homework, a mother counting coins before ordering, 2 teenagers laughing too loudly over shared fries. The world spun as usual, no one realizing he was there on purpose, not for a role, not for a stunt, but because he had started to feel disconnected from the lives happening far below the red carpets and bright lights. He had told his agent he needed research for a small indie project. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. What he really needed was to remember what ordinary hardship sounded like when it didn't have a script. When his break ended, he rejoined Maya at the counter. Her shoulders seemed tighter now, the strain more visible. She greeted him with a stiff half-smile that faded before it fully formed. As the dinner rush hit, the line grew longer, the orders more chaotic. A machine broke. A tray slipped and fell, drinks exploding across the floor. Someone cursed from the kitchen. The air thickened with stress, impatience, and the constant ticking of the timer screens blinking in accusing red. He moved closer to help her bag orders, sliding napkins into paper bags, passing her cups just as she turned to reach for them, trying to make her job even a little easier without drawing attention to himself. Up close, he caught the faint scent of cheap soap on her sleeves, the slightly frayed thread on the collar of her shirt. Nothing about her said, "This is temporary." Everything about her said, "I've been surviving like this for a long time." Then, right in the middle of a rush, a phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She hesitated, torn between the line in front of her and the sound in her pocket that clearly meant more than another order. The manager's voice rang sharp from the back. "No phones on shift, Maya. Focus on the customers." Maya flinched, nodded, and tried to keep working, but her hand shook as she passed a receipt. The buzzing stopped, then started again, more urgent this time. She bit her lip, eyes glassy. He watched her glance around, then whisper, "I'm sorry, just 1 second," as she slipped the phone out just low enough that only he could see the cracked screen light up. A single message preview glowed there, the words short and terrifyingly clear. He saw her eyes scan the text once, then twice, as if hoping she had read it wrong. Her breath hitched. Her knuckles went white around the phone. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant blurred into a distant roar in his ears. When she finally looked up, her face had gone pale, the thin mask of professionalism shattered. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, to ask for help, to say she needed to leave, but no sound came out. Customers were shifting impatiently, a kid whining about his drink, someone tapping a credit card on the counter. She blinked hard, forcing the tears back, then failed. One silent tear slipped down her cheek, carving a clear line through the tiredness on her skin. He turned his head slightly, trying to read the rest of the message before she locked her phone away, but she pressed the screen against her chest with a tiny, desperate motion, as if shielding it from the world. For a second, they stood there side by side, both of them pretending nothing had changed, while everything clearly had. Her fingers hovered over the register keys, frozen mid-motion. The line kept building. The manager's voice cut through the air again. "Maya, let's go. You're holding everyone up." Her hand finally dropped from her face, but the tears didn't stop this time. They flowed silently, stark and unhidden. And in that frozen, unbearable moment, he realized he couldn't just stand there as the undercover guy anymore, playing along with the scene like it was some harmless experiment. Whatever she had just read on that screen had broken something open inside her, and he was the only one close enough to see it. He drew in a breath, stepped half an inch closer and reached out, resting his hand gently but firmly on her shoulder, just as her knees seemed to weaken beneath her. She tried to straighten to force her voice into that same hollow customer service tone, but now it came out thin and cracked, barely a whisper. He heard it anyway. It was only 4 words, almost swallowed by the noise around them, yet heavy enough to cut straight through the hum of fryers and the clatter of trays. "I think it's bad," she murmured, eyes fixed on nothing, as if the world beyond the counter had suddenly disappeared. She didn't look at him when she said it. Her eyes stayed locked on the glowing menu board above the counter, as if focusing on those plastic photos of burgers was the only way to keep from falling apart. He followed the tiny tremor in her voice down to the hand still clutching her phone through the thin fabric of her apron. Whatever it wasn't late rent or a missed call. It felt bigger, heavier, like the kind of news that rips a quiet hole in a person's life and lets all the light out. "Order 47, someone shouted from the kitchen. A kid in a hoodie waved his receipt impatiently. Another customer leaned closer to the counter with a sigh. Time refused to stop for her grief. The restaurant kept moving like a machine, grinding forward, indifferent to the one person inside it who could barely breathe. "You okay?" he asked softly, the words so simple they sounded useless even as they left his mouth. But it was all he had in that second, wrapped in the voice he used when cameras were off and there was no one around to impress. Just a man asking another human being if they were going to make it through the next minute. Her head moved in a tiny, automatic nod, the kind people give when they're lying to themselves more than to anyone else. Then after a heartbeat, she shook it, once, twice, like maybe honesty mattered more than pretending. "My brother," she whispered, the words barely shaped. "Hospital, they said it doesn't look good." The last 3 words broke off, catching in her throat as if just saying them out loud gave them too much power. Behind them, the manager pushed through the kitchen door, wiping her hands on a towel, already frowning at the stalled register line. "What's going on out here?" she demanded, her eyes darting from him to Maya's tear-streaked face. "We've got a lobby full of people waiting." Maya straightened so fast it looked painful. I'm sorry, she said, trying to wipe her cheeks with the back of her hand, smearing her own tears. I'm fine. No, you're not. He cut in gently, his voice steady but firm. The words surprised even him. The undercover role, the quiet observer, the guy who fades into the background, that version of himself stepped back. Something more protective, more stubborn, moved in its place. "She just got bad news," he said, turning slightly so he stood between Maya and the impatient line, his body a small barrier. "She needs a minute." The manager's gaze hardened, impatience flaring. "We don't have a minute during rush," she snapped. "If she needs to cry, she can do it on break. For now, she's on the clock." Her tone was sharp, but underneath it was a tiredness that matched Maya's, a tiredness of schedules and shortages and too many problems for one thin paycheck to solve. He felt a familiar anger rise, quiet but hot, the same kind he remembered feeling years ago when he first watched a friend get talked down to by someone with just a little more power and a lot less compassion. He had promised himself back then that if he ever had the chance to be the person who stepped in instead of the one who looked away, he would. Undercover or not, this was that moment. "I can take the register," he said. "She can step away." The line behind him shuffled, customers muttering, unaware of or uninterested in, the storm gathering on this side of the counter. He didn't care. For once, the script didn't need their approval. The manager laughed, short and disbelieving. You started, what, 2 hours ago? You're barely trained. The last thing I need right now is another problem to fix." "It's not a problem," he replied quietly. "It's a person." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the smell of grease, sharper than the beeping timers. Maya's shoulders trembled behind him. She pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. The manager hesitated, eyes flicking to the growing crowd, then to Maya's red-rimmed eyes, then back to him. Some part of her recognized the truth in what he'd said, but reality tugged at her sleeve. Corporate rules, performance reports, the threat of being replaced if numbers dipped. Kindness had a price here. So did disobedience. 2 minutes, she said at last, her voice clipped. "Maya, go to the back and pull yourself together. Then you come right back. Understood?" It sounded less like permission and more like a warning disguised as mercy. Maya's chin trembled. "Thank you," she whispered, already turning away, but her steps were uneven, like someone walking on unfamiliar ground. At the doorway to the back room, she paused and looked over her shoulder, eyes meeting his for the first time since the message had come through. The gratitude there was shaky, fragile, wrapped in guilt, but real. He stepped forward to slide in front of the register as she disappeared into the back. The headset scratched against his ear, the drive-through voice crackling with another order. The screen in front of him blinked with items waiting to be rung up. Behind him, the manager exhaled sharply and stalked off, leaving him alone at the front line, exactly where he had never planned to be. "Next," he said, his mouth forming the word out of habit from watching her all afternoon. A woman stepped up, thrusting her card forward before he could finish repeating her order. As he tapped the buttons, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the smudged plastic screen, uniform, visor, faint lines of concern around his eyes. No one in that lobby saw a movie star. They saw another underpaid worker trying not to mess up. He rang through a few more customers, his movements clumsy but improving with each transaction. Still, his attention kept slipping to the door to the back room where Maya had vanished. Every time it opened for a tray to pass through, he half expected her to return, eyes dry, mask back in place, her grief folded neatly into a corner of her chest so she could finish her shift. Every time the door stayed closed, his worry deepened. Then 5 minutes later, longer than the 2 she had been allowed, the manager reappeared from the hallway alone. Her face had changed. The impatience was gone, replaced by something tight and unsettled. "Where's Maya?" he asked quietly, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. The manager didn't answer right away. She looked past him, scanning the room, as if hoping Maya had magically reappeared somewhere she hadn't checked. When she finally met his eyes, there was a flicker there, a brief, reluctant crack in the hard shell she wore over her own exhaustion. "She's not in the back," the manager said slowly. "Her apron is, her headset too, and the side door's open." She swallowed, voice dropping even lower. "She just left." A tray clattered in the kitchen. Someone called for more fries. A kid at the counter started to whine about his toy. The world kept moving, but inside his chest, something lurched into sharp, sudden focus. She hadn't just stepped away to cry. She had walked out into a night filled with whatever was waiting for her on the other end of that message, and she was out there alone. He tore off his headset, feeling his own pulse pounding in his ears. For a moment, he didn't think about the cover, the plan, the quiet anonymity he'd promised himself. He didn't weigh the risk or the headlines or how strange it would look for a brand new worker to suddenly bolt mid-shift. He only knew one thing with startling clarity. If he let her disappear into that dark parking lot without anyone at her side, he'd be breaking a promise he hadn't even realized he'd made. To her, to himself, to every version of him that had ever vowed to show up when someone was drowning in silence. The manager stepped closer, confusion slicing through her frustration. "What are you doing?" she asked, watching as he laid the headset gently on the counter like he was setting down something far heavier. He looked toward the exit, then back at her, his jaw set with a resolve she didn't yet understand. "I'm going after her," he said quietly, "and I'm not letting her face this alone." He pushed through the glass door into the evening air, the sudden quiet hitting him harder than the cold. Behind him, the restaurant noise dulled to a muffled hum, a self-contained world of beeping machines and impatient customers. Out here, the parking lot felt almost eerily still. The sky was sliding from blue to deep purple, and the overhead lamps buzzed faintly, casting cones of harsh white light across rows of cars and stained asphalt. For a heartbeat, he didn't see her. Just a couple arguing softly beside a minivan and a delivery driver scrolling on his phone near the back entrance. Panic flickered in his chest. What if she had already left, taken a bus, vanished into whatever emergency waited on the other end of that message? Then, by the edge of the lot near a cracked concrete curb, he spotted a flash of red and black. Maya sat hunched forward on the low step, elbows on her knees, head in her hands, apron crumpled beside her like a shed skin. He walked toward her slowly, careful not to startle her. His shoes crunched on scattered gravel. She didn't look up. It wasn't until he was close enough to see the way her shoulders shook, the way her whole body seemed to curl in on itself, that she finally sensed him there. She wiped at her face quickly, smearing her tears, trying to reclaim that mask she'd worn all shift. "I'm sorry," she blurted before he could say anything. Her voice was hoarse, edges raw. "I know I'm not supposed to leave the floor. I couldn't breathe in there. I didn't mean to screw things up." "You didn't screw anything up," he said gently, taking a seat on the curb a careful distance away, not so close that it crowded her, not so far that she felt alone. The ground was cold beneath him, and the faint smell of fryer oil and car exhaust hung in the air. "You got a call about your brother. Anyone would have walked out." She gave a bitter little laugh that had no real joy in it. "Not anyone who needs rent money," she said. "Not anyone who's already on their last warning because they came in late twice and called off once when their mom had surgery." She twisted her fingers together, the skin around her knuckles rubbed raw. "I don't have the luxury of falling apart." He let that sit for a second. There was no easy answer to it, no quick line that could erase that kind of exhaustion. He remembered nights on worn-out couches, doing the math on bills that didn't care how tired you were. Different life, different specifics, same weight. "What did the message say?" he asked softly. "If you want to tell me." He made sure those last 5 words were clear, no pressure, no demand, just an open door. Maya stared at her phone, still clutched in one hand. The screen was dark now, but her thumb rubbed across it like she could feel the words through the glass. He's in the ICU, she said, voice trembling. "My little brother, 18. He was supposed to start community college next month." Her breathing hitched. "Car accident, a drunk driver. They said his spine is damaged, internal bleeding. They don't know if he's going to wake up." Silence spread between them, thick and heavy. A car door slammed somewhere behind them, distant and unimportant. He pictured a hospital room he'd never seen, machines beeping in stubborn rhythm, a kid lying still in a bed that looked too big for him. The unfairness of it pressed hard against his ribs. "I was supposed to be there," she whispered. "My mom's alone at the hospital with him. She texted and said, 'I think you should come now just in case.'" Her voice cracked on the last 2 words. "And I'm here, arguing over fries and drive-through timers." He turned toward her, really looking at her past the uniform and the grease stains and the corporate name tag. "Why aren't you there already?" he asked gently. "What's stopping you?" She laughed again, that same brittle sound. "You're new, so you don't know," she said, not unkindly. "If I walk out in the middle of my shift, that's it. Fired, no final paycheck, no favorable reference. They'll put a note in the system. Unreliable, walked out mid-rush. And then every manager at every chain within 10 miles will know exactly what that means." "And if you stay?" he asked. She pressed her lips together so hard they trembled. "If I stay and something happens and I wasn't there," she swallowed, shaking her head. "I don't know if I could live with that, but if I leave and lose this job, we can't pay his hospital bills or the rent or—" her voice thinned to almost nothing. "There's no right choice, just different ways to drown." He felt that line settle into his chest like a stone. Different ways to drown. The way she said it, flat, resigned, made it clear this wasn't the first time she'd had to choose which pain to live with. "How long have you been working there?" he asked, nodding toward the restaurant. 2 years, she said. "Started in high school, didn't leave after. My dad left when I was 16, so it was just me and Mom and my brother. She cleans offices at night. I take whatever shifts they give me. We've been playing this survival game for years." She let out a long, shaking breath. "And now it feels like we're losing." He thought about the director who had called this whole undercover plan a social experiment. an interesting way to connect with the struggles of everyday people, maybe sneak in a few feel-good moments for a behind-the-scenes feature. Sitting here beside her, that idea felt insulting. This wasn't an experiment to her. It was her life. "What do you want to do right now?" he asked quietly. "Not what you're supposed to do, not what the handbook says, you Maya." For the first time, she looked him fully in the eyes. Up close, he could see the raw redness there, the faint lines of worry etched deeper than any 20-something should carry. Her answer came out in a shaky rush, almost before she'd given herself permission to say it. "I want to go to the hospital," she said. "I want to hold his hand and tell him he's not allowed to leave me and that I'm sorry I couldn't protect him from some stranger who decided his night mattered more than anyone else's life." Tears welled again, spilling over. "I want to be there if he—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "Okay," he said, "so that's what matters most." Her shoulders slumped. "And then what? I walk back in there tomorrow and they tell me I'm done. We lose the apartment. My mom burns out trying to work double shifts. The hospital calls asking about payment and we have nothing." She laughed weakly, shaking her head. "You don't get it. Wanting something doesn't make rent cheaper." He could have told her that he did get it in his own complicated, different way. He could have pulled off the visor right there, told her his real name, watched her eyes widen with recognition. But this moment wasn't about that. Revealing who he was might shift the gravity of the conversation away from her and back onto him, and that felt wrong. The power he had, he needed to use quietly, not as a spotlight. "You're right," he said instead. "Wanting something doesn't make the bills go away." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But leaving your brother alone right now, that's a cost you'll carry for the rest of your life. Money hurts, guilt it claws." She flinched as if the truth of that had physically touched her. For a second, her facade dropped completely, and he saw the terrified older sister underneath, the girl who had probably been taking care of everyone except herself for a very long time. "We don't have anyone," she murmured. "No savings, no friends with houses big enough to sleep on their couch if we get evicted, no safety net, just us, just me." She looked down at her trembling hands. "I don't get to be reckless." He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. The air between them held a fragile tension, like a bridge made of glass. "What if," he said slowly, "this isn't reckless? What if going to the hospital is actually the bravest, smartest thing you can do? Choosing your brother over a job that would replace you in a day if they had to." Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't seem to come just from helplessness. There was something conflicted there, a battle between fear and a defiant little spark that refused to die. "And what if they fire me?" she whispered. "What then?" He felt the answer before he spoke it, a quiet resolve settling into him, rearranging his own understanding of what he was willing to do here. This wasn't just about seeing what life was like on the other side of the counter anymore. This was about whether he would actually use the weight of his own life to change hers. "Then you won't be alone," he said. "If they fire you, I'll help." He saw her brow furrow, skepticism flickering across her face. "I'm serious. I'll make sure you and your family have enough to get through this, however long it takes." She stared at him like she was trying to decide if he was cruel or crazy. "You don't even know me," she said. "You've known me for what, 3 hours? People don't just say things like that, not in real life." He swallowed, feeling the old instinct to stay small, stay quiet, stay anonymous. But anonymity was its own kind of cowardice if it meant watching someone drown when you owned a lifeboat. "Maybe they should," he said softly. "Maybe we've all gotten too used to pretending we can't change anything." He held her gaze, willing her to hear the sincerity underneath the strangeness. "Look, I get that this is hard to believe, so don't believe my words yet. Watch what I do." Her phone buzzed in her hand again. She flinched, unlocking it quickly. Her face drained of color as she read the new message. For a second, her breathing stopped and then came back as a shaky, shallow rush. "What is it?" he asked, his chest tightening. She swallowed, staring at the glowing screen as if it might burn a hole straight through her palm. "My mom," she whispered. "She says the doctors want to talk to the family." Her voice dropped even lower, turning thin and frightened. "She says, please come now, they don't think he has much time." The world around them seemed to blur, the edges of the parking lot softening, the buzz of the lights fading into a distant hum. In that moment, there was only her, the phone, the terrible urgency of those words, and the ticking, merciless question of what she would choose. Her fingers tightened around the device until her knuckles went white. "If I go," she said, her voice hollow, "there's no coming back from it, not with them, not with my job, everything changes." She turned her face toward him, eyes wide and shimmering. "What if I make the wrong choice?" He could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down on both of them, heavier than any scene he'd ever acted, more unforgiving than any script. This was real, and there would be no retakes, no editing, no safe distance. He drew in a slow breath, measuring the words he was about to say, knowing they would shape everything that came next, for her, and maybe for him too. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the scariest choice is the only one that lets you look at yourself in the mirror 20 years from now." He paused, his own memories stirring like ghosts. "You already know what you need to do, Maya. You're just afraid to say it out loud." Her lips parted, trembling, as another tear slipped free. And for one suspended heartbeat, she sat there at the edge of the curb, caught between the fluorescent glow of the restaurant behind her and the dark unknown of the night in front of her. Between survival and love, fear and courage, teetering on the brink of a decision that would break something open in both of their lives. She stared at the parking lot, at the sliding doors of the restaurant, at the cracked concrete under her shoes. The whole world seemed to narrow to those 2 points, the light behind her, the darkness ahead. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, like her body was trying to hold her in place by force. "I can't lose everything," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Not after all this time, not after everything we've already survived." He watched her for a long, quiet moment. The sky above them had deepened into full night now, the first stars barely cutting through the city's glow. He thought of all the times he had stood on his own invisible edge, afraid of the cost of choosing what he knew in his gut was right. The fear never really went away, but sometimes, if you stepped anyway, the ground rose up to meet you. "You won't lose everything," he said softly. "You might lose a job, but you will not lose yourself, and you will not lose your brother alone." Her shoulders quivered at that word, alone. She closed her eyes, squeezing them shut like she could press back the flood of panic. In the dim light, her face looked years older than it had when he'd watched her joke with customers earlier that day. This was what constant survival did. It aged you from the inside out. "What if you're wrong?" she asked, opening her eyes again. "What if I go and nothing changes? What if I still lose him and then I come back to nothing?" He didn't have a promise big enough to erase that fear, and he refused to lie to her. Instead, he shifted closer, his voice low and steady. "Then you'll still have the one thing that matters most. You'll know you were there. You'll know you didn't let fear of money keep you from holding his hand. Grief is heavy, regret is heavier." Her chin trembled, the last of her resistance thinning. She looked down at her phone again, at the message from her mother. He saw something shift in her gaze, not that the fear disappeared, but that something stronger rose up beside it. Love had a way of doing that. It didn't cancel fear, it simply refused to let fear drive. "I can't stay," she said at last, the words coming out on a ragged exhale. "I can't sit here serving burgers while my little brother might be," she swallowed, voice breaking. "I have to go." He nodded once, slowly, like she'd just made the bravest confession in the world. "Okay," he said, "then that's what we'll do." The word caught her. "We." "We," he repeated. "You're not doing this alone." He stood, brushing gravel dust from his uniform pants, then held out his hand to her. "Come on, let's tell them you're leaving, then we'll get you to the hospital." She stared at his hand for a second, as if it were some kind of trick. Then, with a small, shaky breath, she slid her palm into his. Her fingers were cold and stiff at first, but they tightened as she pulled herself upright. For a moment they simply stood there, side by side in the yellowish parking lot light, two people who had walked into that shift as strangers and somehow stepped out of it bound by something far more human than job titles. Inside, the restaurant looked almost surreal now, like a stage set they'd stepped away from. As they pushed through the doors together, the sounds rushed back, clanging metal, beeping timers, overlapping voices. The manager spotted them immediately, eyes narrowing at the sight of Maya out of uniform and him by her side. "Where have you been?" she snapped, marching toward them. We're down a person, the line S backed up, and you, she jabbed a finger at Maya. You disappear, you can't just walk out in the middle of a shift. That's not how this works. Maya flinched, instinct driving her to shrink back, to apologize, to promise she'd do better. Her mouth even started to form the words. Then she stopped, took a breath, and straightened, just a little, but enough. Her eyes met the manager, S, and when she spoke, her voice was still unsteady, but there was a quiet steel threaded through it. My brother is in the ICU, she said. They don't think he's going to make it through the night. My mom is alone there. I'm going to the hospital. The manager's expression shifted, annoyance colliding with something more vulnerable. For a second, the practiced corporate lines she'd probably been repeating for years faltered. Maya, she said, her tone softer but tangled. I'm sorry, but you know the policy if you walk out. I know, Maya interrupted gently, though her hands shook at her sides. I know the policy, and I know I might be fired, I understand. She swallowed hard. But if I stay and he dies and I wasn't there, I don't know how I live with that, so I'm leaving, now. He watched the play of conflict on the manager's face. In her tight jaw and tired eyes, he could see a mirror of another reality. Single mom, late bills, a district supervisor who only cared about numbers, not people. But there was still a choice here for her, too. You'd put your job at risk, the manager asked, almost incredulous. After everything, after how hard you've worked to keep it. Maya's answer came faster this time. Yes, she said, because he's my brother, and this might be the last chance I get to tell him I love him. Her lips trembled, but she didn't look away. A job can be replaced, he can't. Something in that sentence landed with a heavy, undeniable truth. The kitchen had gone a little quieter, workers pretending not to listen as they exchanged quick glances. Even a few customers near the counter fell silent, the scene pulling them in despite themselves. The manager closed her eyes briefly, running a hand over her face. When she opened them again, they were still conflicted but softer. Clock out, she said at last, the words low and reluctant but real. Officially, I'll tell them you had a family emergency and had to leave early. She exhaled, shoulders sagging. I can't promise what corporate will say tomorrow, but I won't write you up as a walkout. Maya stared at her, confusion and relief warring across her features. You'd do that? She asked. The manager shrugged, glancing around at the other workers at the chaotic line. This place will still be standing in the morning, she muttered. Your brother might not. Her voice cracked almost imperceptibly. Go. For a heartbeat, it looked like Maya might collapse from sheer relief. Instead, she whispered, Thank you, then moved to the time clock, hands fumbling on the keypad. Her eyes were still wet, but her spine was straighter now, like choosing had given her back a part of herself she'd been slowly losing. He watched her finish, then stepped up beside her again. The manager turned to him, irritation returning as a sort of defensive shield. And you, she said, you can't just leave too, you're still on shift. He met her gaze calmly. I know, he said, and I'm sorry, but I'm going with her. The manager scoffed. You barely know her, this isn't your problem. He could have left it there, kept his truth tucked away. But something in him refused to walk out of that building without letting the people inside know exactly what had just happened, and what it meant. He took off the visor, set it on the counter, and then reached up to gently remove the headset, placing it down with care. For a second, the small gesture looked like nothing more than a new worker quitting on his first day. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but unshakably clear. I'm making it my problem, he said, because it should be all of ours. The manager frowned, clearly not understanding. Around them, a murmur had started to ripple through the workers and a few customers who recognized his face now that the brim of the visor was gone. Phones lifted, whispers spread. One of the crew members in the back froze, spatula halfway in the air. Wait, is that? A teenager at the counter whispered to his friend. Recognition hit like a slow wave. The manager's eyes widened, the color draining from her face as she finally saw him not as a clumsy new hire, but as the man she'd watched on screens, the one her son had posters of on his bedroom wall. Her jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. You're, she started. He shook his head gently. It doesn't matter, he said. Right now I'm just someone who can help and I'm going too. He turned back to Maya, whose eyes were now huge, stunned, her brain catching up to what everyone else was realizing. She stared at him, mouth slightly open. I thought you just looked like him. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile. Sorry for the weird surprise, he said softly. I didn't come here to trick anyone, I came to learn, but right now that doesn't matter as much as getting you to your brother. Her shock battled with the urgency of her situation. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, insist she couldn't accept help from someone like him, that this was too strange, too much. But the message on her phone, the ticking clock in her chest, overruled everything else. I don't have a car, she said numbly. The bus will take almost an hour with all the stops and transfers, the hospital across town. I drove, he replied. We'll be there in 15 minutes. He turned back to the manager one last time. I'll cover whatever shifts she misses, personally, and if corporate has a problem with that, they can call me directly. He scribbled a number on a napkin, slid it across the counter. That's my team's line. The manager stared down at the napkin as if it were some kind of portal to another world. When she looked up again, her expression had softened into something almost like respect. Take care of her, she said quietly. And tell your brother's doctors there are people rooting for him tonight, even from the Fry station. Maya's eyes filled again at that. She nodded, unable to speak, then turned toward the door with him at her side. As they stepped out into the night, the restaurant doors closing behind them with a soft hiss, it felt like more than just a physical exit. It was as if she was stepping out of a script she'd been trapped in for years, one where she was always overworked, underpaid, and quietly invisible, and into a story where she was allowed to be the one who mattered most, at least for this night. The drive to the hospital was quiet at first, the city lights streaking past the window in long, blurred lines. He drove faster than he normally would have, but not recklessly, every minute weighed against the image of a hospital monitor flatlining. Beside him, Maya clutched her phone like a lifeline, her thumb hovering over her mother's contact. Call her, he said softly. Let her know you're on your way. She nodded, fumbling with the screen. When her mother answered, her voice came out thick with tears and fatigue. Mija. Mom, I'm coming, Maya said, her own voice shaking but determined. I'm in a car. I'll be there in a few minutes, I promise. There was a small, choked sound on the other end. They said he's fighting, her mother whispered. They're doing everything they can, but they don't know how long, her voice broke. Please hurry. I will, Maya breathed. Tell him I'm coming. Tell him he's not allowed to go anywhere until I get there. When she hung up, the car fell silent again. He could feel the fear radiating from her, but beneath it now was something else, purpose. She hadn't solved everything. The bills were still real. The job might still be gone tomorrow. The future was still terrifyingly uncertain. But in this moment, she was headed exactly where she needed to be. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly, staring straight ahead at the road. Really? You could have just finished your undercover thing and left. Why risk all of this? The attention, the cameras, the stories people are going to make up. He thought about it for a second, choosing honesty over any neat, polished answer. Because I've had people I loved in hospital rooms, he said quietly. And I know what it feels like to wish you'd done more, to wish you'd been there sooner, stayed longer, said one more thing. He swallowed. I can't change what happened in my past, but here now I can help you change yours, and if I didn't, I don't think I could look myself in the mirror the same way. She turned her head slightly, studying his profile in the passing streetlights. Whatever she saw there seemed to settle something inside her. Her fingers relaxed a little on the phone, though she still held it like a tether between her and the hospital. You know, she murmured, when I first saw you today, I thought you were terrible at this job. He laughed softly, the sound cutting through the tension like a small beam of light. You were right, he admitted. I am terrible at it. But, she added, her voice softening, you're pretty good at this part. What part? He asked. Not letting people drown alone, she said. They pulled into the hospital parking lot, the harsh white glow of the building washing over the car. As he parked, Maya exhaled, the sound shaky but resolute. Her fear hadn't vanished. But courage, he realized, rarely showed up without fear sitting right beside it. He turned off the engine and looked at her. Do you want me to come in with you, he asked, or wait out here? For a moment she hesitated, then she nodded. "Come," she said. "At least to the waiting room. I don't know what they're going to say, and I don't want to hear it alone." They walked into the hospital together, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft whoosh, the antiseptic smell hitting them like a reminder of every vulnerable moment that had ever taken place inside those walls. Nurses hurried past, voices low and urgent. The world here was different from the restaurant, but the stakes were so much higher. At the ICU entrance, a nurse stopped them, eyes flicking from Maya's tear-stained face to him, doing a quick double take. Recognition dawned, but to her credit, she didn't react beyond a brief blink. This was a place where fame didn't matter as much as heartbeats and vital signs. "Family only past this point," the nurse said gently. "You're his sister?" she asked Maya. Maya nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Maya Rivera, my mom is inside already." The nurse checked the clipboard, then opened the door. "You can go in," she said. "They're waiting for you." Maya turned to him, eyes wide and wet. "Will you be here when I come out?" she asked, the question bare and childlike in its hope. He felt the weight of it, the trust she'd placed in someone who had been a stranger just hours ago. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll be right here, however long it takes." She held his gaze for a second longer, then stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the ICU. The door closed softly behind her, leaving him alone in the narrow waiting area with its muted colors and two bright lights. He sat down in one of the plastic chairs, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. Around him, other families whispered, paced, stared blankly at vending machines. So many lives hanging in the balance, so many decisions and sacrifices that would never make headlines or trending topics. Minutes stretched, then doubled. At some point, he realized he was holding his breath every time footsteps approached, exhaling only when they kept walking past. He thought of the fryers and timers and drive-through headsets, of how easily he could have finished his undercover day and gone home with nothing more than an interesting story. Instead, he sat in this too-bright room, waiting for news about a boy he had never met, hoping that one choice, hers and his, had been enough to change something that mattered. The ICU door finally opened. Maya stepped out, her face flushed, eyes swollen, but her mouth curved into something fragile and luminous. Not joy exactly, relief, disbelief, a stunned kind of gratitude. "He's alive," she said, voice trembling. "They don't know what the recovery will be like, but the bleeding has slowed. He made it through the surgery. They said it's a miracle he held on long enough for them to operate." Her breath hitched, halfway between a sob and a laugh. "Mom said when I walked in and grabbed his hand, his heart rate went up on the monitor, like he knew I was there." He felt his own throat tighten, his chest fill with something warm and painful and unexpectedly light. "I'm glad you went," he said, the words inadequate but true. She nodded, wiping at her face. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I almost stayed and finished my shift like nothing was happening." She looked down, shaking her head slowly. "If I had and something had happened to him before I got here, I don't think I ever would have forgiven myself." She lifted her gaze back to his, eyes shining. "You helped me choose the right kind of pain," she said. "The one I can live with." They sat in quiet for a moment, the hum of hospital machinery and distant voices filling the space between them. Then she frowned, worry returning to her features. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "The job, the bills, everything, I don't know how we're going to," she trailed off, biting her lip. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened a note he'd prepared earlier that year. A list of contacts, funds, and resources he'd set aside for exactly this kind of moment, even if he hadn't known what form it would take. Quiet promises he'd made to himself that, if he was ever in a position to truly change someone's life, he wouldn't hesitate. "I meant what I said," he told her. "You're not facing that part alone either. I can help with the bills, the rent, finding a job that treats you like a human being, not a machine." He saw the protest forming on her face and held up a hand. "Not as charity," he added gently. "As an investment in someone who showed more courage today than some people ever do in a lifetime." Tears spilled over again, but this time there was a small, incredulous smile tangled in them. "I don't even know how to say thank you for that," she whispered. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just, When you're in a position to help someone else one day, remember how this feels, and do for them what you wish someone had done for you sooner. She nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling into her like a seed planted deep. In that moment, he knew this wasn't about a celebrity saving a stranger. It was about a chain reaction, one act of kindness sparking another, stretching out into futures neither of them could yet see. They walked back toward the ICU door together. Her mother appeared in the narrow window, eyes red but hopeful, waving Maya back inside. She turned once more to him. "Will I see you again?" she asked, a little shy, a little afraid this would all evaporate when the night ended. He smiled, soft and certain. "Count on it," he said. "This isn't just a one-night story." As she disappeared back into the room where her brother lay fighting for his life, he sat down in the waiting chair again, feeling the strangeness of it all. He had gone undercover that morning to understand fast food work, to see the world from behind a counter. Instead, he had witnessed something much more raw, the impossible choices people made every day quietly without applause. In the weeks that followed, headlines would spin the story in a dozen different ways. About a famous actor working incognito, about a tearful cashier and a rushed drive to the hospital, about unexpected generosity and miracles. But that night, in the quiet glow of the ICU hallway, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a sister had chosen love over fear, that a brother had felt her hand in his when he needed it most, and that a man who had once felt small and powerless had remembered that the truest use of any kind of power, fame, money, influence, wasn't to stand above people, but to kneel beside them when they were breaking. And as he finally stepped out of the hospital hours later, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges, he realized that the real undercover work hadn't been about blending in at a fast food counter at all. It had been about quietly showing up in someone's most fragile moment, witnessing their courage, and walking away changed, determined to turn one night's promise into a lifelong habit of choosing kindness, no matter the cost.